I'm grateful to be with y'all. I enjoyed it. It's been a while since I've been in front of y'all. So here's kind of what we're looking at for the next, 8 weeks before we break for the summer. We're going to do a few weeks on what I've titled Evil and the Existence of God. Now, when I took this course in seminary, it's titled The Problem of Evil. And that's generally what you'll see from an apologetics standpoint. And I know Eric touched on this a little bit when he was doing apologetics, but I tend not to phrase it like that because from an analytical perspective, when you tell somebody we have a problem, then their initial response is, how are we going to solve that? And the reality is there's two perspectives on kind of evil in the world and the relationship of God to that. The one that I prefer the most is that from a problem standpoint, it's been solved. It was solved at the cross. But what we haven't seen is the final result of the solution that came from the cross. And so that's going to happen when all things are made new. And then it will actually be done away with. So that's the general way I look at it. But in the meantime, if you start thinking of the problem of evil, how are we going to deal with that? How do we get rid of it? The realities are it's going to be here until Christ comes back and makes all things new. So I don't look at it from being a problem that like we're going to solve. And if we do something different, if we live different or speak different, then we would actually be able to get rid of evil in the world. I just don't believe that's a reality. So I tend not to talk about it like that. So the way we're going to look at it is kind of the foundational or the fundamental issue of evil in the world, how it's here, what it is, and then looking at it from our perspective, which is a Christian perspective of how does that relate with a good God? How is evil in the world if there's a good and perfect God that's actually sovereign over the world? Because those who are opposed to Christianity, those who are opposed to religion at all, their premise is that's a proof that God doesn't exist. And so we answer that in a different way. And that's what we're, over the next 3 to 4 weeks, that we're going to look at that, at the aspects of what evil is, and then ultimately looking at how we would respond to that and how that works as far as the physical world that we're in. And then when we're done with that, probably going to look in the last few weeks at a study on James, and we'll finish with that. But I did an entire semester on this subject. I don't think you really want to do that. So we're not going to pound 8 weeks into this. We're going to kind of look at hopefully just kind of the main points and from a discussion standpoint, if I hit on something and you're not quite sure, then we will do it in such a way that you can say, well, what about that? And we can talk about that versus kind of when I did Romans, there was so much in there, we were really pouring through it. So I'd like to get feedback if there are things that either don't make sense or you're not sure of, or you have a different perspective, then you need to be able to share that. Does that make sense to everybody? So tonight we're just going to kind of look at the foundation of how we're going to go through this over the next few weeks. And so the primary thing that you'll see at the top is evil in the world because of the fall should not surprise us. And so you can see that in John 16:33, Jesus' words himself said, in this world you'll have tribulation, but take courage, I have overcome the world. And so he didn't say there's tribulation and I have gotten rid of it. He says I've overcome it, but we're going to have it. And so there should be an expectation from our perspective that evil or suffering, and we'll talk about the differences even in the terms, is really not an anomaly, but it's part of the normal fabric of life, okay? But when I say normal, I don't mean normal as God intended, okay? God did not intend the world to look like it does. He built it with a certain pattern to it. And so it's not normal from his perspective that he wanted the world to look like this. But it's normal because of the fall that it does. And so we shouldn't look at this constant battle between what we call good and evil as something abnormal. That's a consequence of the fall all the way back to the garden. And it's going to be lived out until the words that Jesus say actually get fulfilled when it's all renewed. Does that make sense? Okay, good. And so I put another verse when I say the normal fabric. It's from Acts 20, and this is Paul when he was in Ephesus for the last time and meeting with the people. And you know, Paul spent a huge amount of his ministry, 3 years at least, in Ephesus. And so he was there, and he was going on to Jerusalem. And so when you're thinking, all right, what do we think about? What should we think about? How does this fit? And so in verse 22, and I'll just read all these two verses for you, Paul's telling them, he says, "And now behold, bound in spirit, I'm on my way to Jerusalem, not knowing what will happen to me there." Not knowing from a standpoint of he didn't know exactly how he'd be treated, but he did know this. He says, "Except that the Holy Spirit solemnly testifies to me in every city, saying that bonds and afflictions await me." So he didn't know exactly what it was going to be in Jerusalem, but he knew what it was going to be. He didn't know the actual what bond or affliction it would be, but he knew, because he said, "The Holy Spirit has told me, in every city I've been, bonds and affliction will await you." And so he just assumed that was, as we would say, part of the job. That was part of the mission. And so to Paul, and we can see that in his other letters, he picked that up, that when he was in prison, when he was being persecuted, when he was being beaten, he actually saw that as validation that the gospel was moving forward. If it wasn't, then he would think that the Holy Spirit was not being truthful to him. And so he actually looked at that as, I'm doing the right thing. My mission is doing what it says because this is exactly what the Holy Spirit has told me is going to be there for me. So that means in his mind, what we would see as a hindrance to the gospel, he saw it as a furtherance of the gospel. And not just that he was able to, as we would say, give testimony in prison, either to prisoners or the guards, but that as people saw what he was doing and how he lived it out, that in itself was a testimony. And so in that way, even suffering played into the furtherance of the gospel. And he said it was actually evidence of that. So for us, when we don't understand why things don't work in what we would consider the pattern they should, that does not mean that God's not at work. And to a skeptic, that God doesn't exist. I think it actually works totally the opposite. And so for a secular non-believer, and really a lot of Christians over the last 200 years especially, and 200 because, and I know Eric talks about this, but when you look at from the Enlightenment on, the mindset of how suffering and evil worked in the world, especially what we would call unintended, it's brought this question of, is God real? Is God listening? Does God hear me? Is he really all powerful? And so it's within and outside of the church in the last couple hundred years. And so these modern objections that we look at are really, they have roots way, way, way back. And you can see in there, I've got a quote from Epicurus. He was a Greek philosopher. He lived, you can see, his peak was around 300 to 290 BC. And this was a statement that he said, so is God willing to prevent evil and not able? Then he's not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he's malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Where does evil come from? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? And so this foundation has really found its way into even what we call modern thought. If you will read some of the skeptic stuff, you can see it kind of comes back to this same premise about the objections to how a God could be over a world and be totally good, totally powerful, all-knowing, and allow this to happen. And so they're using this example. And so over the time, we're going to look at some objections and answers really to how this works, I would say. How God's existence, how he governs his creation, and then allows these things and where it comes from. So we're going to start just talking about, when you start talking about something, the best thing to do is, all right, what exactly are we talking about? So what is evil? I mean, if I had y'all write down, give me a definition for evil, I'd probably get 20 at least different definitions for what you consider evil. A lot of times that's just because of what experiences you've had in life and how things have impacted you. And so, but for our purposes, we're going to try and actually define from a biblical perspective and from the reference point of God what we're talking about. So metaphysical, which is the physical world that we talk about, evil itself really isn't a thing, okay? It doesn't exist like a created thing. That doesn't mean that it's not real, but think back to Genesis, all right? Genesis 1, from the moment he speaks until he rests, what does God say? He creates, and it's what? It's good. And at the end, it's very good. So God creates everything that's good, all right? And then what we know is that with the snake, then we see sin and death and what we would label the ability, evil, would enter the world at that point. And so it wasn't created, but it meant there was an opportunity for it. But God did not create evil. And so evil is the corruption of a good thing. And so it's actually something that acts upon something that's good and changes it to where it does not operate in the purpose or manner for what it was created for. And it's actually something that acts on something. We would call that corrupts something, like acid can corrupt metal. And so evil it takes something good and changes the purpose. All right. So so you can see, and you'll hear this word as we go through it, trilemma. So when you get into the academic world, these philosophical arguments will come in what they call a trilemma. And if you think of it like you're an old mathematic proof from geometry, it's kind of that, like an if-then statement. And so you can see here's one statement that's saying that against that God caused it. It said God only created, and I said created, so you can see, no, he actually created, he didn't create. Created actual things or substances. Evil is not an actual thing or substance, so God could not have created evil. So these are called trilemmas, and we'll look at some different ones as we go through that. But my real explanation is heat. We know what hot and cold is. But actually, heat is what exists. Cold doesn't really exist. Cold is the absence of heat. And so if you've got a heat pump or you've got something, it's measured in BTUs, British thermal units. And so as things get hotter, it'll measure in BTUs. As things get cooler, you lower the BTUs. So cold is the absence of heat. And in the same way, light, lumens, are measured, and when you take lumens to 0, you get total darkness. So darkness doesn't really have an existence. It's the absence of light. And so I like to think of evil in that sense, that it's measured by the absence or the diminishment of God's good purposes on his creation. As you strip out God's purpose for something, then you create room for evil to be in that. Does that make sense from that standpoint? Okay, good. So that's kind of what I'm talking about. And so ultimately, good can exist. What we know, good can exist apart from evil. But evil cannot exist because it needs a good thing to prey on. So it doesn't have an existence outside of itself. And so in the world we live in, we think of things from a dualistic viewpoint, like the side of a coin. Everything's got its heads or tails, hot or cold, good or bad, light or dark. And so we live in a dualistic world. Well, God's dimension is not like that. Okay? And that's ultimately where we want to be when we're called home and when He makes everything new. And so that will then be separated. Now, so our minds kind of wrap around that. But we know what He said at creation, it was totally good. There was no evil at that point until we, humans, brought it in and allowed it to come in. Now, He allowed the ability for that in the physical world, but we do know in heaven there's not the ability for that. God is totally and completely good. So there is no bad. There is no duality in His dimension. And so at the beginning, that's kind of the way it was. And so what happened because of us is we allowed evil to come in when we know that Adam and Eve ate from the forbidden fruit. And that knowledge of evil then allowed it to come into their minds, and it allowed them to see how things could be corrupted. And it allowed the accuser and the demons access into this world. Then the full duality of that came in upon us. I know that's kind of head-spinning stuff sometimes, but that's ultimately the world we're in. And so now we're in that. There's life and death, but we know that there's going to be a world that God has promised that half of that equation is going to be removed, and there'll only be the good. And that's all we will know. We won't even know the other side of that. God will, but then we will not, which to me is a beautiful, beautiful thing. And so as we go through, there's primarily two categories that we're going to look at, and that's the way when it's broken out is moral evil and natural evil. Okay? Now, moral, and we're going to go deeper into these in the next couple of weeks on each section, and so and how they work along God's existence. And then we're going to look essentially at human suffering outside of evil intent as well, because we know that there is suffering outside of evil. Yeah.
We implied and said that God didn't create evil. Did God create good?
Yes.
He said it was good, so how do we define good?
By His standard. I mean, that's a great question. But as a believer, the standard of everything is God's speaking the standard. Would y'all agree with that? What God says is the standard. Whether we perceive to understand that standard or not. So when God calls a thing good, that thing is good. If He calls an action good, if He calls a person or a thing good, then it's good by His definition. And that's a great point, because we're going to get into that later, because ultimately to understand the difference between good and evil, we're going to get into, well, who has the right to decide that? Well, if you're a believer in God, only He has the right to decide that.
You know, I can say chocolate is good, but that's just an opinion.
That's right. And we would call that a preference, all right, versus a law, all right? And God has no issue with preferences. He's given us freedom in preferences to things. He has not given us freedom to determine right from wrong, good from bad, or good from evil. But He's given us plenty of room for preferences to decide. He doesn't care whether you like ketchup or mustard. He would call both of those food. And He says you can eat that or not eat that. And that's what we call a preference. And there's nothing wrong with that. But to say adultery is good because you're fine with it, but God says it's not, you don't have the right to do that. God has the sole right to do that. Now, an atheist, to further your point, let's just say a non-believer would come in and say, well, who has the right? Who says there's a God to determine that? We think society determines that. And the answer to that question would then say, well, is there anything that you believe to be wrong morally across all cultures, across all genders, across all time? Ask somebody that. And if they can come up with one thing, all they need to do is come up with one thing. Murder, rape, killing a baby, just one thing. Would you say that killing a baby for pleasure is wrong in all cultures at all times for all people? I would think pretty much everybody that we know would say, yeah, that's wrong. Then we'd say, well, where does that come from? It doesn't come from you. It doesn't come from a vote. You just know that is naturally wrong. So
that would show the existence of God himself.
Yeah, so that comes from something outside of us putting that into us. Then you got to say, well, then who do you think, now you're into, well, who do you think that is? Or what is that? That would give you the ability to know innately something is wrong with that. So, and somebody had to be the determiner of that and had to place that inside of you. Now, you can argue about who that God might be, but now you've already moved to there's something outside of us that has set some type of natural law that we may not agree on all of it, but we know there's some things, as we would say, everybody just knows that's just wrong. How do you know that? It's not because Congress voted on it. You just innately know it. Where did that come from? So that's something we're going to get into. So you're already a philosopher and adding that into my stuff. And so, but there is human suffering that would occur that we wouldn't necessarily label evil. And we'll kind of look at the role of suffering, kind of like what Paul just said and how that works into our life. Yes, Steve?
The first thing he said, it is not good, and I don't think it means evil. It's not good for man
to be alone.
And I don't think he meant that's going to be evil for man.
Yeah.
It's almost like it's not best for man.
Well, but then how did he cure that? He said because he didn't have a suitable partner, right? All the animals had that, and he realized nothing he had created. So it was like, I haven't finished exactly what I want to do with man. Almost like you said, it's not quite finished with him because he has done everything I've asked him to do as having authority over all that, but now he can't find his own partner because he's alone. And alone is not good. Even with God and his relationship solid, he knew for an earthly relationship, he needed something else. Didn't mean he left it out or forgot it. It's just not complete. So I agree with that. So moral evil, just when we get into that, so what are we talking about? So moral evil is when free persons, and that's something we'll be looking at, what does freedom mean? When free persons misuse their freedom in such a way that their action violates a moral standard. So this goes back to what was just brought up. What's the moral standard? And it's the standard that God imposes on his creation of what he calls good and what he calls not good. Not good would be our violation of that moral standard. And so when a free person essentially has the freedom to act or not act and misuses that freedom in such a way that it violates a moral standard, that's what we would term moral evil. And so Eric has brought this up. I've got the word in there, hamartia. That's the word that the Greek word that we commonly associate with sin, means missing the mark. I know a lot of people have used the analogy of firing an arrow and you don't hit the target, but I think Eric has summed it up the best in that we miss the mark of bearing the image we were created to bear, which meant we were created for a certain purpose, and when we're held to the standard of the purpose we were each created for, we miss the mark. We don't measure up to what we were created to be, and that is sin. And so moral evil is what comes out of that. And so it moves. We talk a lot. I know the Bible talks a lot about temptation and how does that fit with this. So moral evil is when you move from a desire or a temptation to forming intent. Okay? You don't technically have to do the thing. If you move from a willful intent to do something, then you have moved to a position of creating or carrying out moral evil. And that's not the same as thinking, or we would say a desire, you have a temptation. It's like, when I was a kid, like, man, those Cokes are just sitting on that truck. I could take one of those. Well, that's a temptation because they're all just sitting there. Now, when you start formulating a plan of, okay, when the guy goes inside, and then I can take my bike around here and nobody can see me, and this is how I'm going to do it, and this is how I'm going to execute the plan. That's intent. And that's actually creating evil in my mind. Now, I could be trying to execute that and get stopped before I steal the Coke. Parent could see me, my mom could see me, the guy could come around with my hands on the bottle, and I actually don't steal it, but I've still committed the act because I have actually moved to act on that. And that is still evil, even though we would say technically nobody got hurt. Well, that's because God can still intervene or, in some way to stop it. And we see it all the time where either planned murders will be done. You'll see the police will know things are happening and they will stop. It was still evil. It was an evil act intended, even though it wasn't carried out. So just because I say you didn't get caught, or just because something got in the way to have you actually go through with that, it was an evil act intended. And yeah.
What if you aren't the person doing it, but you stand there while it's happening? You know about the intent and you don't.
And you're not going to try and intervene?
Replace it.
That's whether we call that whether that's actually an evil act or you're party to the evil act. Some call that the sin of omission. I knew about it, I did nothing about it. That's in my mind. There's this. I guess we need God here to really answer that. But that's, at what level does God put it as our responsibility to intervene? Now, I would say to the ability that we would have. You might not have the ability to stop 4 people going in to rob a bank, even though you can see them go in. You might have the ability to call 911. Okay? And I would say if you did that, but to say, well, I saw them coming in and I really did nothing. Well, if you did that, you'd probably get killed. And I would say that's probably, I don't think God would expect that. But to be able to speak up, especially in families, that's wrong. You don't need to do that. If you hear somebody talking about something that's wrong, the ability to speak up, then I think you've done your part. The situation probably determines that. That's probably a good way for me to just throw that away without having to get deep into it. But it's one of those always, it depends, I think. Now, if you know you did nothing, could have said something, watch all this damage go, and I could have at least said something. Probably should have said something. The old rule we had growing up, nobody likes a snitch, Well, nobody likes to get beat up and have their stuff stolen either. So I think they might not mind a snitch if you save these people from doing it. And so, taking a righteous stance, I don't think is there, but I still think there are limits of what would be expected of each of us depending on the situation. That's the best way I can answer that. And so you can see intention there is you get that plan of action. And what we know is man or God can intervene in a situation and stop it. But that did not mean that the act itself, in God's eyes, is the same. And remember, we're looking at it from God's perspective and how we react to that. And so we would say, well, no harm, no foul. It's really not that big a deal. In God's eyes, it's the same. And when you read through the Sermon on the Mount, really that whole thing is Jesus telling especially the Pharisees, your interpretation of the law and what God's interpretation of how his moral law applies to us are on totally different planes. You see it one way. The heaven standard, the kingdom standard is way higher. And so to this moral evil thing, how does Jesus talk about murder? He says, you think you shall not murder, you're fine because you never killed anybody. But I say, if you call somebody an idiot, you're going to be called before the Supreme Court. You basically says you killed them in your heart. He says you haven't committed adultery. I say if you look on a woman with lust, you've committed adultery. So that would be the comparison that we're talking about here. To God, intent is the same thing as carrying it out. And I tell you, when I'm driving in my car, I murder people all day long. All day long. What an idiot. And gosh almighty, do you not even know what you're doing? Because what am I saying? What Jesus is saying, Rob, in your heart, you're saying your life is better if this person didn't exist. Because if they didn't exist, they wouldn't have made you miss the traffic light because they sat there until it turned yellow and then they went through. Now you're waiting on the rest of it. And you're basically saying, if you were dead, I'd have been through this and I'd be 3 minutes earlier on wherever I was trying to go. And Jesus is saying that's murder. In God's kingdom, that's murder. And I'm saying, I didn't want him dead. He goes, well, that's where your thoughts were taking you. That's the next logical step to where your thoughts are taking you if you leave them unbridled. And he says, that's the standard in God's heaven. And that's kind of how he looks at you. And I'm thinking, man, that's a standard I can't live up to. And he goes, exactly. Exactly. So how we look at moral evil, even in the world, is one, it helps me not be quite as judgmental as I probably want to be about what somebody else does compared to how I would handle it. And because God's justice is going to be carried out. And that's one thing we can count on. So what, these examples, what you're seeing is evil can occur absent of suffering. But what we also know, suffering can occur outside of an evil act. And in some cases, when you're doing something we would call righteous. And so the example, if a criminal is convicted and sentenced to prison, he's going to incur, or she's going to incur suffering, right? They're going to be separated from family. They're going to be locked away. They're going to be put in restriction for some period of time or life. That's going to incur suffering, but that's not necessarily evil. It's certainly not wrong. It would be carrying out the standard of the consequence for the act. And so even though suffering occurs, you can't say, well, that's evil because suffering has occurred. So there's not this perfect relationship that every time we see suffering, that means there's some result from evil. And the flip side of that, in the case now, and only talking about one party here, so don't misunderstand, as we think suffering's the normal result of a moral evil, not in all cases. And adultery's one of those. Because to one or two of the parties, they may get emotional or physical pleasure out of it. And that's what they sought when they went into it, even though it is 100% morally wrong. Now, we know there would be suffering on others when it ever came out. There'd be other parties that were hurt. But as crazy it is, I have seen people say, I don't care. I got what I wanted. I'm perfectly happy. I don't care. And we would go, that's just nuts. But they're fine. They got what they wanted. And there's no consequence to them for that act, even though it put consequences on the other side. So the main point there is you can't just perfectly link evil, especially moral evil, with a suffering result with that. And so and you can see here the last thing on that. Jeremy Evans, he wrote the book that we used in seminary called The Problem of Evil. So he takes us back kind of to the forbidden fruit in Genesis 3. And what did God say about it here? He says it was good for food and it was pleasing to the eye. So even though the forbidden fruit had good aspects to it, it violated the divine command to eat it, regardless of whether it could produce technically a good consequence for that person. So it's wrong. So just because there won't be physical punishment or pain that comes from the act doesn't mean that it's not wrong, because God says it is. And ultimately it was wrong because Adam and Eve basically valued the knowledge of good and evil over the knowledge of God. They swapped the lesser for the greater. And they already had the knowledge of God. They had the greatest thing. And they decided something lesser was more desirable than the greater. And that's a corruption of the order that God had set for us. Again, he never said why they couldn't eat it. He just said they couldn't. And because he's God, he has the ability to do that, because he is all-knowing and understands the plan. And so, any other questions on moral evil? Like I said, we're going to spend one session just on that. Yeah.
I think I'm a little bit confused, because like if I was thinking in terms of a person getting put in prison and they're suffering, then I would say that that was a direct cause of their evil action. Or if an adulterous thing happened, well then one person's going to suffer because of an evil action.
That's right.
Or if Adam and Eve ate fruit, we all suffer today because of that action.
Yeah.
I'm having a hard time separating or trying to think of an example of a suffering occurring without the cause being evil. Cancer, person suffers from cancer because of sin.
Yeah, we're going to get into that. Well, in the case of where I used adultery, realistically, you would say until it was discovered, no one would be suffering, if you follow that. So let's just say there's two people in that example that are committing adultery, two people unaware of that. Usually there's 4 involved in most cases. Obviously, when it's found out, there's suffering on the ones who were betrayed. So I'm not arguing that point at all. But I'm saying they're in the midst of the act by the persons doing it, they could be perfectly at peace, getting pleasure with no intended result to each other. You follow that?
Yeah, that makes me think of that saying like stolen bread is sweeter, but in the end it's bitter.
Right.
That the sin might be exciting in the moment.
That's right.
But in the end,
ultimately it's going to come back on you. I don't think, I'm not in any way saying that moral evil never will have consequences. What I'm saying is in the initial eye or look, it can look like it didn't, that it was just a good consequence. And to the person committing it, as we know, there are sociopaths that commit murder with zero, but we know there's obviously suffering on the one killed. I'm essentially, in that instance, it was before the discovery. There would be good or pleasure to the people with no consequence to the other because they were unaware. Does that make sense? So they're rare, I would say. Like I say, normally we're going to associate some sort of suffering or pain. The prison thing, yeah, that's just it. Suffering is incurred. It's incurred intentionally on a person by another person. Yeah, the prisoner, it's a consequence. We know that. But a judge has to sentence them, and people have to lock that person up. So they're the intent of that person suffering, but it's not an evil act to do it. If you were a prison guard or a judge, sentencing somebody to prison is not an evil act on your intent, even though it's going to cause suffering to that person. That's kind of the point I was going at. you would not be committing an evil act by doing that, because you're willfully causing punishment to that person. But we would call that a righteous, actually we'd call it in Scripture, with what God lays out, especially in Leviticus, it's a righteous act, because you're doing what He's told you to do when this occurs, even though it causes pain and in a lot of cases death or ostracization of a person being put outside the camp. Does that help?
Right, yeah, that makes more sense.
Okay.
From the prisoner's standpoint of
Yeah.
suffering because of his.
No, mine was from the person that actually causes that. It's not evil. All right. And so the second category we'll talk about is natural evil. And so that was just brought up there as one of those. And so, and for our conversation, we're going to say natural evil and natural suffering are kind of the same thing. All right. Because it's hard to differentiate a natural occurrence and actually label it as evil. Because it doesn't have a human intent. Because what we talked about, moral evil involves humans acting upon another with intent. And so it's pretty easy, in most cases, for us to make a determination of that act being evil if a person does it to another. We have a generally, especially according to God's word, whether that's evil or not. With natural evil, and we'll break that down into two subcategories when we look at it. Ecological, which we're very familiar here with hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, those kind of things. Fires are what we call ecological, natural suffering. And biological, what you just mentioned, cancer, infection, infirmity, those are biological, natural. And I generally would use suffering, because to call nature evil, I think, is not really a correct determination, but it certainly causes suffering. And we can tie it to an act. We know when Hurricane Sally came through, or Ivan came through, or Frederick came through, we know that certain act caused this destruction. We know the pain that came out of that. We've seen the suffering, the death that came out of that. But to actually call that evil it's a stretch. It's a hard attribution to say, well, that was an evil intent on the world. We do know from Job, in chapter 1 of Job, we can see Satan is allowed to use biological elements against him. And that was certainly an evil act, because we were, as I say, God allowed us through His Word to kind of see behind the curtain. Now, Job couldn't see it. He didn't realize that was being perpetrated upon him with intent, but God allowed us to see that there are forces in nature that, for whatever reason, He allows to a certain boundary to be used against His people. But we don't know that. We know it with Job because it was written about. We don't know it with individuals. And one of the things we know from reading Job, which there's so much insight into that book, the predominant feeling at that time, and the predominant feeling of a lot of religions all the way now through today, a predominant belief of Judaism is a cause-effect relationship. And you can see it in Job's friends. If this happened to you, you must have done something, because that's how God works. You know, God doesn't put bad things like this on people if they don't deserve it. So what's the unrepentant sin in your life? Well, we know that wasn't the story. Who was the battle, since we're in that, who was the battle between in the story of Job? Any ideas? Think? Say God doesn't really, that's certainly a thing. But who was the main one for? It was Satan and Job. I mean, Satan wanted Job to curse God. That was the whole point. And, and the interesting thing there, which really only in the last week or so, that I really picked up on through one of these commentaries was God brought him up first. Satan didn't bring him up. And I'm like, why would he do that? He said, have you considered my servant Job? Why point him out? You know? And that's it. There's so much why in that story. But Satan wanted Job to curse God. Now, Job complained a lot, but he never did. You know, even his wife told him to do it, and he never did. He certainly asked a lot of questions, and he complained, but he never cursed or doubted the existence of God through it. So Satan lost in that battle at great cost, I would, obviously, to Job. So, but we see that he used a lot of things. Satan had the ability with boundaries. And the key there is God is still sovereign even over this and has boundaries on limits of how far. Remember, he had to ask permission. He couldn't do a thing without God granting permission. Now, why? That's the question for the ages. And I certainly don't have the knowledge, and would not presume the knowledge of why God does certain things. But what we can see in the story is there are always boundaries to how far he's going to allow something to go. And what we know is in his word, there will be a boundary at a time, and then he's going to say, that's enough, and we're done. And all ability for that is going to be done away with. And that's when the answer of the cross is going to be actually brought forward. We also see in Genesis how God himself uses plagues and natural elements to produce judgment. He brought plagues in to bring judgment against Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And remember, the first 4 that were on everybody? So even the Israelites, I think, were affected by the first 4. I think it wasn't until the 5th that he said it's only going to be on the Egyptians and not on my people. So the first 3 or 4 affected even the Hebrews, and were part of that. Even though it was to bring judgment on Pharaoh and the Egyptians and to show the power of God. And then obviously later in Genesis we know famine went throughout the whole land into Canaan and into Egypt, and God used that to bring reconciliation into Joseph and his brothers. And so he can use it for judgment, and he can use it for other things, for good, and even the great thing that Joseph said, you intended it for evil, God intended it for good, which meant he allowed it to happen and ultimately used it to bring a certain result. And there's a great story, I just gave you the snippet, but Elizabeth Elliot wrote in a book, and she was talking about this a shepherd in Europe named Mac, and she had been on his farm, and she's watching him deal with these sheep. And he's bringing them in one by one, and he's got a tub. It almost probably looks like one of our baptismal tubs that you would have. She said it had this thick, black, gooey liquid in it. And it was an antibiotic that the sheep had to have. And it had to get in everything to keep them from getting infections and diseases. And he'd bring these sheep in one at a time and toss them into this ooze and just hold them under. And the sheep would try and get out. And he's got his sheepdogs on both sides of it. And as soon as they come out, these dogs are jumping up and snapping at them and barking at them and scaring them back in. And he's holding them under until that stuff gets everywhere on them. And she goes, it smelled bad, it looked bad, and they hated it and thought, why is he doing this to me? And I love how we're always described as sheep. And that's kind of what struck her. And what she said was, I just wanted so badly to be able to tell those sheep, this is for your good. You just have no idea what's waiting for you if you don't do this. All of this is for your good, yet they believed everything was acting against them. And that's when she said, and then I realized I'm the sheep. And the way things happen, if you know, she lost her husband down in the jungles of Ecuador. Into the Spear was the movie that was done about that when Jim Elliot was killed. And it allowed her to say, I don't have the knowledge to understand how God is working for my good. And even in things that I would think are horrible and painful will ultimately have a result, and He allows it for a certain reason. And my good friend Jack Hester, he's the pastor at Mars Hill, he said, God will never protect you from what He can use to perfect you. And I always have to remember that in things that seem to be rough or difficult in my life, somehow He's using that to polish and perfect me if I can allow it. Doesn't mean I'm going to understand it. Doesn't mean I have to be happy about it. But I have to understand that He's sovereign and He will use everything. And usually it's because I'm probably too stupid to learn it any other way. And that's a hard thing for me to accept, that this is the only way I'll be able to learn what He wants me to learn. But He is always working for our good, even in bad things. And so there are going to be certain arguments against God. We're going to be looking at some of those. Because, you can't deny, all you have to do is go home tonight and watch the news. There is no prevalence or no lack of suffering inflicted upon humans and creation in general that we attribute to natural and moral destructive events around the world. I mean, we know what's going on in Ukraine, we know what's going on in Israel, and those are just the flashpoints. There's stuff like that going on in Africa, in China, all over the world. Whether it's being done to Christians or their own citizens, there is unbelievable suffering being perpetrated on purpose, and natural events like the bridge collapse in Baltimore that happen all the time. And so, people will look at this, and especially non-Christians, and they use that to try and validate that God does not exist. And so you've got another trilemma there. William Rowe, he's a non-believer, and he kind of put this out, and you kind of see it match up to the other. And he says, there exist instances of intense suffering, and it looks like my mic has just gone out. So it probably didn't charge correctly. I'll try and speak up so we can finish up because we're very close. How about that? There we go. Just turned off. He says, there exist instances of intense suffering in which it's running out of juice. Sorry, guys. All right. Which an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. So that's his first point. Second, an omniscient, wholly good being would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering. It could, unless it could not do so without their losing some greater good or permitting some equally bad or worse. Therefore, there does not exist an omnipotent, omniscient, wholly good being. So what do y'all see? And I've got the answers there if you want to read below. So when you read that, it seems to make sense on the surface, okay? But what's wrong with the argument in that form? And it goes back to the question that we had right at the beginning that we were talking about. Who's the determiner in that formula of what's good and what is evil? Man. William Rowe, in his formula, he makes that we're capable of determining what's good and that could have not had any other outcome. He flips the script on the determination that we get to judge God about what we think is good or what we think is bad. And so what we're now doing is putting God on trial in His formula of saying we believe these things are so bad that there's no way any good could have come from that. And because of that, you actually don't exist. And so we put ourselves in the place of God in that formula, which, if you're an atheist, that would probably be a natural thing to do because you believe you're of the highest order. And so that's when you take the ability to determine what's right or wrong, what's good or bad from the Creator and put it in the creation, that's where all your problems come from. And so we get back to that same fundamental argument of a Creator and a creation. And so that's the primary view. And the reason I put it in there is just about every secularist that argues against God is going to use that kind of formula. That you just have to point out what good could have come out of a typhoon in India that kills 25,000 people. You can't tell me that a good God wouldn't have stopped that, because you can't tell me any way any good could have come out of that. Well, we don't know. Now, it's horrible, but all kind of bad happens, and it doesn't have to take even natural approaches to do that. And so, but here's the other thing, they don't provide any solutions. They just present another problem for why is there evil. They don't tell you, but if you do this, then you fix it. They're just trying to say, because of this, there's no God. Well, then what's the answer to why it's there? Well, I don't have an answer for that. And so that's not very good. Now, Richard Dawkins, you've probably heard his name. He's a very popular atheist. His way around it is just to not attach any meaning at all to life. And so then there's not a solution. He says it's all essentially biological function. That's just how we act. And people just do certain things, and it's not right or wrong. That's just in our nature. And so you can't argue good or bad, because in his view, there is no good or bad. There is no good or evil. There just is, because there's really no meaning to any of this. We're no different than plankton in his mind.
So no measuring stick.
No metric at all.
Like, you ever have to think, like, I find that interesting, because people who have never really experienced severe sorrow or loss can say that. So
Yeah.
I'd like to know, did he have an experience in his life where something that had happened that was so horrific that, like, if his wife was murdered?
Yeah, he really doesn't. Here's the thing, I don't think he even believes it. I think he just wants to sell books. He sells a lot of books, but I don't think he even believes it, because he's got people he likes and dislikes. I'm like, well, what does that mean? What does like mean? What does love mean? You know, you have friends, you have this. He would say that's just a chemical reaction. That's how he tries to explain it. Like or feeling, that's a chemical reaction.
That's such, like children that are sexually abused.
Yeah.
Like, don't.
He goes, that's just kind of how the world is. He goes, that's like animals. And yeah, we all go, that's just kind of crazy talk. And it is it's crazy talk. And like I said, I don't think he even believes it. And so outside of that, and we'll end on this. So even looking at nature itself, if you don't have a moralistic view about it, you would think nature is unbelievably brutal and violent without any reason for it. You say, well, I mean, why would it operate like this? And in Keller's book, Reason for God, he said this: if violence is totally natural, and so our violence toward each other is actually a natural thing. We're actually wired to do that. It's something you should do because that's just who you are. That would be kind of a Dawkins thing. Violent people are violent because that's just who they are. It's not right or wrong. And so he says, so why would it be wrong for strong humans than to trample weak ones? Because there's no basis for moral obligation unless that we argue that nature is in some part unnatural. And that's what we argue. What you see in nature, the violence, the brutality, is unnatural. Otherwise, the stuff going on in Ukraine, we would say, hey, whoever's got the bigger army wins. That's just the way the world is. We shouldn't lose sleep over it. That's just how things are. And we see that actually in nature, in animals. Strong ones.
That way before the flood.
Wasn't before the flood. That's right. And so, but he says, so what we know innately is there's something unnatural about nature. It doesn't really work the way it should. And so that's what we're going to be getting into in the next couple of weeks. And so you can see, so how do we explain the suffering we experience in the physical world around us without God? The reality is you can't. God is the explanation for the suffering that we see. And we'll look at the different things, because the whole point is not just to point this out to you. We're setting a foundation. And what we're going to do over the next few weeks is start answering these questions when you get them from people. Well, how do you explain this? And I'll just tell you, the hardest one of all, and everybody gets it, how did any good come out of the Holocaust? How do you explain the Holocaust? And God allowing that. And the only thing and we'll talk a little bit about that.
Well, do you think allowing it and not stopping it are the same thing?
Well, ultimately it did stop, right?
It did.
Or they would have been totally eliminated. And but we're going to try and quantify, well, why did it take 6 million before it would stop? And I'm only going to say this, and there's a really neat book that you can get. It's very thin. You can read it in a couple of hours probably. Andy Andrews wrote it, and it's called How to Kill 11 Million People. It's actually a really good book. When I was teaching ethics at University of Mobile, I had all of my ethics students do their final paper on that book, and they were mad at me. They go, this is a terrible book. Why would I read a book that says, how do you kill 11 million people? At the end, they loved it. I won't give it away. But ultimately, that's how many people Hitler killed. It wasn't just the Jews. It was a whole lot of people. And he went after everybody that disagreed with him. And so it's more than it allowed. And that's an astronomical number. Astronomical number. And so we'll have to look at that. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say, yeah, they needed to die for this reason or that reason. But there's been horrible things going on for a long, long time. And we're going to look at that, about how does even something that horrific fit with the ultimate justice that God has.
And Proverbs is something that it's in the 6th chapter, where God lists 7 things that he hates, which would be evil. They have to be evil he hates.
Right.
It's kind of, there are things that exist today.
Yep.
So he lists 7 idols.
Right.
That he hates. That's his 7 or 6.
But why we're actually talking about all this? So the Enlightenment brought in what we call the modernist period. Now because of World War I and World War II, we've moved into what's now called postmodernism. And it's because the absolute stuff that happened in the 20th century so demoralized all the adherents of the Enlightenment when they saw the horror of World War I and then the horror of the Holocaust, because their proponent was the world's getting better. That was the whole Enlightenment thing. We're getting smarter, the world's getting better, we're going to treat each other better. The more we know and the better we treat each other, all these problems that the world's had, they're going to go away. More people were killed by evil intent in the 20th century than had been killed in history up to the 1900s. And that absolutely crushed all of their philosophical beliefs and said, this is not working. And then they're like, where do we go now? If we're not the answer and our knowledge is not the answer, where do we look now? They had nowhere to go. And that's where you saw the suicide rates in Europe and everything go through the roof after all of that, because they had staked their life that we were the greatest of all creation and we could solve these problems. And then they realized they're worse than we ever could imagine. And so we actually know the answer to that. And that's in the gospel, and it was found at the cross. But now how that gets worked out is still a hard thing to look at. All right? Any other questions? Thank you all for being here. I will not keep you to 7:30 like Eric does. And so we'll get on and we'll do it. So let's have a word of prayer. So Father, we just now we just give you praise. We are talking about a hard subject. It is so much fun to talk about the nice things and the joy that we find in you, and we do find the joy in you. But we know that there are difficult things in this life. And I am thankful, Lord Jesus, that you did not lie to us or sugarcoat that. You actually told us because of your name, it would get worse for us and we would have to endure more. What that looks like, whether it's emotional or physical, can be so tough. And like was brought up, how do you can say, Lord, we can say things they just go along, but until you suffer loss, you don't realize, you realize then you have to look outside of you for something else and for meaning. And we only find meaning in you and at the cross. These are hard questions, Lord. I know that. But you actually give us a way to answer them. Not to answer the why, Lord. It is not to us to come to you. Even Job early was saying, why? It's not us to do that. It is for us to understand who you are and that you are holy, good. You did not break the world. We broke the world. I broke the world. As G.K. Chesterton said, when they asked him, what is wrong with the world today? His answer was, I am. I'm the problem. I'm the one. It's my sin. And it's when we can look at that it's not a dividing line of good and evil with us on one side and evil on the other. That line runs through us. And it's when we can see that line and then give ourselves over to you to remove it. And you place the good in us, Lord. And you make us try and fight for the evil that is in us in rebellion and replace it with the love of the Spirit. And so, Lord, even as we walk through this, that there'd be answers for each of us and how we're to deal with it in our own families and our own lives, but especially with those that we see around us are suffering. Not to try and give an answer as to why they're going through it, but to try and speak comfort over them. I thank you for each of these that came here tonight and ask your blessings upon them in the name of Jesus. Amen. Thank you all so much.